Good afternoon, Grafton Elementary. Today I want to share one of my favorite books with you by Patricia Polacco, John, Phillip, Duck, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Patricia Polacco, John, Phillip, Duck. Let you see the pictures. Edward was a sweet boy who lived with his family on a small farm just outside of Memphis in the foothills of Tennessee. Times were hard and there was a depression on, and money was hard to come by. Even though Edward was just a lad, he and his father worked at the same hotel in Memphis. During the work week, they stayed at the hotel, but on the weekends, they both went home. Edward loved the weekends. He and his family all gathered around the old radio in the parlor and listened to the grand music. Edward especially loved hearing the brass bands play marches by John Philip Sousa. It made Edward dream about wearing a snappy uniform with shiny brass buttons. Someday I'm going to have a uniform just like that. You'll see, he'd say as he marched around the parlor to the lively music. Edward was a dreamer, all right. One time, right there in the middle of the chores there on the farm, he stopped and looked up in wonder. The wild ducks were calling and were flying in a perfect formation. Ain't they grand, Pa? Look how they fly in a perfect V formation. See the one right there in front at the point of the V? He secretly wished that he could be with them, just to touch those feathers and look at them real close. One weekend, while Edward was doing his chores, he heard a tiny little sound coming from the bulrushes at the edge of the pond. When he looked up, there was the tiniest, scrawniest little duckling he had ever seen. A wild one left shivering from the cold. Edward scooped it up in his hands. He couldn't see its mother anywhere. He slipped it inside his shirt so that it would be next to his warm skin. That night at dinner, Edward got the duckling right out to eat right out of his hands. Usually when they are this little, they don't survive, Edward's ma said. And if I can make this little critter well, can I keep him, Ma? Edward pleaded. This little creature will take constant care. And what will he do when you're gone to the hotel for a whole week? Pa said. Edward thought for a moment. Can't we take him with us, Pa? To the hotel? His father scowled. Please, Pa. I'll keep him in the box next to the pantry, next to the cook stove, and he'll be warm. Big Joe'll let me. I know he will, Edward begged. Big Joe's only a cook, and I'm worried about Mr. Shutt, Pa said. Mr. Shutt was the hotel manager, but then his pa and his ma looked at each other. They could see how much that Edward wanted this duck. Well, I guess we can give it a try, but you have to keep him hidden, or we will both lose our jobs, said Pa. Now, Mr. Shutt was a huge man and the general manager of the hotel, and he ran a tight ship and his word was law. His booming voice echoed down the hallways as he inspected the staff, but he was always fair. Edward sneaked his little duckling into the pantry next to the stove, where he and Big Joe the cook could look after him. Of course, after a time, all the hotel staff came to the kitchen just to see how the little fellow was doing. Everyone swore to keep the little duck a secret from Mr. Shutt. Although Edward took him home on the weekends, the duckling soon became a fixture in the kitchen, and pretty soon he could hop out of his box and venture down the hall. But then one day the little duckling waddled right into the lobby, and Mr. Shutt almost saw him. But Edward grabbed up the little fellow and stuck him in his shirt. "You there, boy! Mr. Templeton in 203 wants his shoes shined. Now you run up there and put a shine on 'em like a mirror." About that time, the little duckling gave a very loud quack. Mr. Schutz narrowed his eyes and came right up to Edward. "What was that?" he barked. One of the bellmen started coughing loudly. "That was me, sir. Pardon me, sir." Mr. Schutz glowered at them for a moment. "Well, take care, Bingham, take care," he said. After that, it was a very close call with everyone who worked at the hotel, keeping the little duckling out of Mr. Schutz's way. It was all their secret. Whenever Edward was busy, they all helped hide the little duck. Chief Boyard helped hid him in the under the entree lid. The manicurist kept him on her cart. The valet kept him under his hat, and the front desk crew kept him in the vacant key box. The doorman kept him in his pocket, and everyone fell in love with the little duck. One night, after Mr. Schutz had left for the day, Edward put John Phillip Sousa March on the phonograph. "Watch," Edward says. "All I have to do is tap this stick on the floor, and he'll do what I taught him to do." Edward tapped twice, and the little duck turned around and around. 3 taps, and the little duck marched up and down the hallway. Edward tapped out a pattern, and the little duck hopped right onto the lobby fountain. He did 1 or 2 tricks right at there as Edward tapped the stick. Then he tapped again, and the little duck hopped down out of the fountain and down the hall. Amazing! He marches just as proper as John Phillip Sousa himself. That's it. That'll be his name, John Phillip Duck. And everyone laughed. One day, not long after, Mr. Schutz's hunting buddies were staying at the hotel. They were in town to do a duck hunt at the crack of dawn the next morning. As a joke, they put their live duck decoys into the lobby fountain. Edward watched them swimming there, and his heart ached as he thought of what they would be used for. "Oh, come on, boys. Let's get to the kitchen and pack some provisions for the hunt tomorrow." Edward's heart stopped. John Phillip Sousa was in the kitchen, but Big Joe must have heard Mr. Schutz, because Edward saw him slip John Phillip into the fountain next to the ducks, the decoy ducks. "He'll never find him there," Big Joe whispered as he passed Edward. All that evening, every time Edward tried to get John Phillip out of the fountain, Mr. Schutz seemed to be there with his hunting buddies. Then, to Edward's horror, the men started pulling the ducks from the fountain and putting them into cages for the next morning's hunt. Edward felt his heart skip a beat as he watched the hunters stuff John Phillip into a cage. Edward had to do something. "Wait, please. One of those ducks is my pet." Mr. Schutz and his friends had stopped and turned. Mr. Schutz glowered at Edward. "Well, boy, what is he doing here in my hotel, in my fountain?" Edward was almost started to cry. He told the red-faced manager the whole story about how John Phillip had been in the hotel, and Mr. Schutz's eyes softened. "Please, sir, please, let me show you the tricks that he can do." "All right, boy, let's see." Mr. Schutz barked as he and his friends took seats nearby to watch. Edward turned on the music, and it was a Sousa march, and John Phillip was in the best form he had ever seen. He did all of the tricks without a hitch. He marched to and from the fountain. He hopped in and out of the fountain pool on command. When John Phillip was done, he waddled up to Mr. Schutz, cocked his head, and looked at him. "Well, I